So, hello everyone. Thank you all for joining us with another episode of Coffee with Gable. I am beyond excited to have my guest here, Chris Hurd, the CEO and founder of Firstbase. So, for me at least, you don't really need any introduction. I've been a fan and a follower for for a long time, but still, if you like a brief description about you and about Firstbase.
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me to be here today, Liza. Appreciate the invitation. So, yeah, I'm Chris. I'm the founder and CEO of FirstbaseHQ.com, and we help companies set up, manage, maintain, and retrieve all the physical equipment remote workers need at home.
Amazing. So basically, at least for me, I first learned about you through Twitter, through your very insightful tweets, and I really actually wanted to ask you, how did it all start? Like, why did you start, way back then, tweeting about this? How did you see the reaction? Were you surprised of how many people followed you, believed in what you said, that it resonated with so many people?
Yeah, and I think often the most helpful thing is to sort of take that even a step back before I worked remotely, which is why did I become a remote worker in the first place? And the reason for that was I founded a financial technology company, took the decision to build it remotely for a number of reasons, but most importantly, it was because I missed my daughter walking, laughing, and talking for the first time. So remote work for me was a bridge to a higher quality of life, to spend more time with her, spend more time with my family. And then we basically just discovered all these challenges and obstacles as we became a remote team ourselves. As we started to scale that team, we started to hire people. We discovered how expensive that was, how time consuming it was, et cetera, et cetera. So part of that was I was obviously getting really passionate about the benefits I was getting of remote work, spending more time with my kids, spending more time with my partner, getting to travel more, getting to be more flexible around my work schedule. And I guess writing about it just came as a byproduct of that. I was experiencing something good. I started writing about what I was experiencing, and I think realized pretty quickly that what I was experiencing was something that other people were looking for in their lives as well. And yeah, I guess probably initially it was a little bit surprising how many people gravitated towards what we were saying, and yeah, it's sort of snowballed since then, I guess.
Definitely. And I think that basically we see a huge transformation at this point. So of course, at the beginning of COVID, it was, let's say, forced remote from home. But I do think that a lot of people see the benefits, but also downside of, let's say, forced remote work from home, which is not really remote work. It's not what we are talking about. And first of all, I can completely resonate with what you say. I also have a daughter. I don't think that I could ever do what I'm doing without being fully remote with my team distributed anywhere. Like the fact that I'm able to, switch between a meeting, an investor meeting, a customer meeting, and then go and play with her for a little bit, or just kiss her or smell her. You know what I mean? So I completely agree with that. And I think that's one of the things that also employees see as a huge benefit in that sense. But how do you see the world transforming after COVID? Like, what will stay, what is not, and what do companies really need to do in order to stay relevant?
Yeah, I think you make an important point. I think it's important to acknowledge that this hasn't been remote work as normal. It's been remote work in the most difficult circumstances imaginable, with lockdowns, people homeschooling their kids, people who can't leave the home, they can't go and grab coffee to get out the house for a few hours, they can't see their families. So I think it's important to start from that perspective. And I think with that said, I think what's been most startling to me has been the number of people who still want remote working opportunities after this. I think the expectation would be that actually they've had a bad experience, so there may be a reaction against remote work, there may be a pullback to the office, but that really hasn't been what we've seen in the data. The majority of people want to work remotely at least one day a week. Only one person in 25 wants to go back to an office full time, whereas 30% want to work remotely full time, and 24 and 25 people want to work remotely at least one day a week. And I think you sort of allude to it there, where what are companies going to do? I think what companies have to do is offer more flexibility to give the worker the opportunity to decide where they work in order to ensure that they retain talent, but also that they can attract talent as well.
Completely agree. But let's focus on the flexibility side. Let's say, how do you describe flexibility? I think you often tweet about basically future of work is basically future of living, and I think flexibility is a key part of it. So how do you see this? Like, how do you describe this flexibility, and in general, what is the future of living in a sense?
Yeah, I think it's from a place that I guess is cognizant of the place that the office evolved from. And by that, I mean that it was almost a continuation of the Industrial Revolution, where people were working in factories, and then we transitioned to this more knowledge-based economy where the technology was in the office for people to use. So they had to be on site. And we just sort of continued down that path of 9 to 5 working, which didn't really empower the individual to do the best work that they've ever done in their lives, but it was convenient because everyone's there. And as that's progressed, and obviously technology's grown inside the workplace, everyone has a computer. We can now jump on a call like this and speak to people all around the world. There's no real benefit to holding someone in a 9 to 5 if they're not most productive at that place. So when I talk about flexibility, it's sort of, it's about an evolution away from what it used to be, which is catering to the collective, creating a workplace that works relatively well for everybody, but not particularly well for every individual. Whereas flexibility is about how can we empower the individual to design the workday to maximize their own personal productivity and do the best work that they've ever done in their lives, whether that's from an office, whether it's from a coffee shop, or whether that's from home.
It's funny because I read somewhere that you said, like, basically the 9 to 5 work schedule towards like flexible work schedule is like Amazon to a regular bookstore in a sense. So how do you see this going, like, in terms of even the 9 to 5, like, let's say remote work, do you think that it really works for everyone? Like, are there specific, industries or roles that might not be relevant to that? That's one thing. Do you think that even it's something that needs to be considered? And the second is actually in terms of, the entire ecosystem support towards the flexible, and what does it mean in terms of the companies to actually support this?
Yeah, so I think the first part's super interesting. I think the e-commerce versus physical stores is a great metaphor for why remote work, flexible work dominates physical office-based companies. And for exactly the same reasons, right? Amazon was able to have the biggest inventory in the world comparative to local bookstores. Remote's the same. You can hire talent all around the world rather than in a fixed location. It's more convenient. You don't have to commute. It's just more efficient and all things like that. So I think that's the first part that's interesting. The second part, which I guess is where and why do people do it? Maybe is the way to think about it, which is slightly different than. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I think it does. Definitely.
So I think that the e-commerce to physical stores things is something I've thought about for a long time. But I think what you'll see happening with companies is they need to react to retain talent. I think that's the main challenge here. If they don't give people the working conditions that they want, then individuals will just go and look elsewhere for companies that will obviously give them those opportunities.
First of all, with that, I completely agree. I think that the shift with this is actually also related to the fact that you cannot sell an office at this point as a perk. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, basically, if beforehand, let's say, even for me, right? I was a Microsoft employee. It was very important for me, to come to the Microsoft office to see everything, all this amazing stuff and so on. And like, it's something that sells, right? So I do think that now companies effectively need to go back and think, okay, what are we selling to the employee to actually come? Is it is it this, or is it actually the culture of the company, the fact that now you need to empower the individual, like in order to make, you as like, you want your employees to be productive, you want your employees to be happy, and I think this is a big mind shift in my view. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I've started writing, I guess, more widely about like office first companies versus remote first companies versus hybrid companies. And I think there's this misconception about hybrid companies. I actually don't think there is such a thing as a hybrid company. I think you're either office first or you're remote first. And what I mean by that is where leadership spends most of their time. So Microsoft, for example, you need to be in the office because leadership's in the office. To progress your career, you need to spend time with them. That's what enables you to get promotions. And that's how you succeed in an office first culture. So wherever the people spend the most time, that defines the culture of the company. So leadership most of the time in the office first culture, leadership most of the time remote first culture. And then I think there's differences between the two because there will be variances. You're not going to be full-time in an office. Some people may spend more time out of the office. Some people may spend more time in the office. So what you need to then do is design a situation which empowers both workers while really giving them what they need. So you need to basically design for remote first, even if you're an office first culture. And I'm sure you sat through situations like this in Microsoft where you're in a room, 8 people, there's a couple other people dialed in, and the quality of the meeting just is never the same because you've got different levels of bandwidth in terms of who can contribute. So simple things like that, where if you're in a meeting, everyone dials in their own piece of hardware, that's super important. So I think organizations need to think, even if they are going to go office first, they need to understand they're still going to have remote employees and they still need to empower them to contribute.
I agree. I think in my view, that's probably the biggest challenge for the hybrid situation. Is basically, how do you even measure, like think about like employee measurement, like in terms of their success, and how do you want them to progress within the company? So how do you measure a person that comes to the office as opposed to a person that is full-time remote or more time remote, right? Because there is a saying like out of sight, out of mind. And how do you make sure that you give those equal opportunities in that sense? I do think that it is, in my view, still a problem yet to be solved in this new environment, I think. But would love to hear from you, what are the biggest challenges you think for implementing this hybrid remote? Like, what do leaders need to take into consideration when they're thinking about it?
I think the biggest thing is actually still trust. Can leadership trust their people to do great work without being micromanaged every minute of the day? I think that's the first part. The second part is exactly what you allude to, which is how do you measure performance? If you're in an office, it's really easy to see, like to say, well, Liza sat in her seat for 8 hours, which means she's productive. And actually, we're not measuring like what you've produced. So is that really a measure? We need to transition pretty quickly from time as the KPI to how much is actually being produced. And yeah, I guess throwing that question back at you as a leader, do you care that your team works 40 hours a week, or do you care about how much they produce?
Completely. It's the latter. Of course, it's how much they produce. I think it's. I think us as leaders, we have to lead by example. So even just in my schedule, all my team knows I have my Emma time. It's basically a block. Then only with my daughter, only with family time. Doing those things. And I have also I think it alludes also to the first thing that you mentioned about trust. Actually, is that in order to create trust, you need to create visibility, in my opinion. So there is a lot of how do you build a culture that is everybody gets to first of all show what they do, but also be aware of what is done. With the leadership team, with any other component in the company. I think those are probably, in my view, are keys in order to make this a successful thing going forward, and definitely measure by the performance. Basically, I always tell my team, I don't care when you do it. I just want this to be, we want to do this, we want to succeed. We're never measuring ourselves by, okay, I need you to work on this 2 hours, 3 hours. If you do this, I always have a very big passion towards data-driven approach. And if you'll ask any one of my team, I always say this, that like, I'm not trying to be annoying, I'm just trying to be smart about what we do. So I always want us to have great processes in terms of really understanding, having visibility of what is working, what is not, and how can we improve. And by that, I think we give also the opportunities to each person to actually demonstrate what do they do and how do they measure that. I think that's a really big thing. And maybe that actually leads me to a follow-up question back to you. How do you see this for your company, to empower your people to be either more productive or to achieve their goals? How do you see this in this, you're basically leading this, but how do you implement this in-house?
Yeah, I think for us, there's a number of approaches. So firstly, it's pretty similar to you. What can we measure and what can we understand? So if we don't measure it, can we really understand how much progress we've made? So that's the first part, measure everything that we can. The second part is trying to avoid distractions. So we've spent a lot of time speaking about how can we empower the individual to do deep, focused work without distractions. And for us, that means how can we work as asynchronously as possible? Now, there's a million different things that go into working asynchronously, whether it's documentation, whether it's the tools that you're using to communicate, whether it's the cadence that you're going to set for time that you do come together synchronously. But I think for me, that is the most important thing about remote. And that sort of speaks to the greater whole as well, which is how can we empower remote workers to maximize the benefits of remote work rather than just replicating the office remotely, which actually hasn't really worked well for anyone. So I'd say those are the two things we tend to focus on. And then the third thing that I think we're beginning to embrace more and integrate more is just transparency. How can we bring more transparency to the process? So every team member understands the KPIs that we're driving towards. Everyone has access to the things that they need, so on and so forth.
I love it, and I think it is something that is still yet to be evolved. In my view, how to do this as a holistic view. How do we make sure that our team members are aligned, are happy, and are included on a daily basis? And I think it actually leads me to my follow-up question about the role of HR. That I do think that has changed a little bit based on effectively with the fact that you don't see the people, they're not coming to the office. How do you see that the role of HR has changed, or let's say even are there new roles that you think that should arise from this in order to help companies that either going fully remote or hybrid remote?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it boils down to what is the purpose of HR, and I think in many companies there's obviously good things HR are responsible, and then there's the reality of what HR is responsible for. But I think if you distill it down, what most leader would talk to you about HR being responsible for is culture. How can they help us build a culture inside the organization? And I'm not necessarily sure I buy culture as even a thing. I think culture is a bit of a myth.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what is culture? How do you?
Yeah, people speak about our culture is unique. Exactly. It's just nonsense. It's like a word people throw out there, but doesn't really mean anything. We've got a good culture, you've got a bad culture. Okay, but why? Largely what you're talking about is a collection of relationships driven by specific individuals that dictates the culture of the company. Right. So I think what's actually more helpful to think about HR as is how can HR build a company that's a community? And I think for me, that's way more interesting because there's a lot more opportunity to do things that enable a remote distributed organization, which hopefully is more diverse, it's more inclusive, and it's more accessible. And I think to me, that's what's more important than, I guess, HR and culture and nonsense like that, which I just don't think is true.
First of all, as an engineer, I completely agree. Like basically, what I cannot measure is very hard for me, or what is not, what does it mean? How do you build a culture? I do think that, it is a very nice word to describe. Basically, in my view, it's processes, it is the vision of the founders of the leadership team and how do they implement them in a sense. That's one thing, but I would love for you to maybe touch a little bit more on the community aspect. What do you mean in terms of community? Is it the connection between the employees, the collaboration? How do you see this?
Yeah, I think there's a few parts to it. So I think everyone's probably seen that community has become something that's incredibly important outside companies. So how can we activate our external community to help us build a better company? And they contribute in all sorts of ways. It can be in helping lead sales. It can be in driving growth. It can be in whatever else you want to think about. And for me, I think thinking about that in terms of the internal culture, and you can think about people in the same way. If you've got a community inside a company, that can help you with hiring because it comes a place that where people feel belonging. They feel like there's a purpose to what they're doing. And I think much of that, companies try to be a little bit too prescriptive on how that happens. I think the best company culture and community is organic. And I think what you want to do there is when you do come together physically is being super purposeful about communication and collaboration. So the way I like to explain it to some people is that many people's expectations are that companies that are in offices have better interpersonal relationships, they have better communication, they have better collaboration. I actually don't think that's true. I think many remote workers have closer relationships with their remote workers because when they do see each other physically, they have more in-depth conversations and it's coming together with that purpose. Whereas if you're in the office, it's like, did you see that new show on Disney Plus? Did you hear what happened on the news? Whereas I think if I meet up with you like once a month, once a quarter, I can say, oh, how's Emma? Is she walking yet? Is she doing, et cetera, et cetera?
I see your point. But even, but it is in terms of, okay, when you meet, it is meaningful. But what about the day-to-day? How do you keep this, right? How do you keep this communication? How do you keep this? I'd love to hear from you. What do you think we as leaders can do, or every individual to be? I think you need to be mindful of this in a sense.
Yeah, I would say you have to be more mindful and you have to be more purposeful about it. So definitely having processes around cadence of communication, cadence of physically coming together. I would certainly bow to Darren Murph's superior knowledge on this. He's written more than probably anyone else around how you do this. So
definitely,
yeah, check some of the GitLab stuff out. For us, I think there's like, I don't know, quirky things that we do, which is like, we've just got a Slack channel that's dedicated to basically saying good morning and good night, and everything else happens in different channels. But yeah, it's just a way for us to know when people are there for the day, when they're actually gone for the day, and in some respects, setting expectations for how quickly we're going to expect a reply. But yeah, to your part, I think it's just being more purposeful and mindful about it.
I love it. We'll definitely implement this. It's funny, we're a small team, but we're already across 4 time zones. So it's going to be very interesting to see the good morning and good night throughout the day, basically.
Just seeing them overlapping, probably by the hour.
Overlapping, yeah, definitely. Actually, a follow-up question. I think it's on a different aspect. Is how do you see the real estate industry going forward? How do you see? Basically, you spoke about this. So that's like in a high level. But what do you think in terms of what? Yeah, we can close it with that, right? But like, if we'll point to this a little bit more, if you like, of course. Sure. How do you see them actually, evolving? Like, what is the next? How can they help? I think because there is stuff like we discussed, like there is meaning to in-person meetings. In a sense, like it doesn't have to be every day. It needs to be purposeful. Exactly what you said. Like, how do you see the new office, let's say, facilitate that? And what what does the real estate industry needs to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm being facetious. There are still going to be physical spaces. Let's start with that.
Okay.
I think what is dead is bespoke headquarters. It just doesn't make sense. Why do you need a flagship location for 50,000 people to sit in, where you've got people working on different floors where they're effectively remote from each other anyway? There's no benefit to that. So I think what happens is it changes. And what it changes to is the same stuff that we were talking about earlier, which is e-commerce versus physical stores. Now, e-commerce didn't wipe stores out entirely, but it changed what people's expectations were when they did go to stores. And what people wanted when they were buying in-store versus online is more of an experience. And that's going to be the same thing in offices. What people want when they go to an office is an experience. They're coming together to spend time with people physically, whether that's on their team, whether it's in co-working spaces with strangers, whether it's in a coffee shop. When they come together, what they want is a reason to do that. And I think that's super important. I think we're not going to be in a situation where people are just going to jump on the tube, jump on a subway, commute mindlessly to an office for 2 hours a day, to sit in a seat on the laptop that they've carried from home for 8 hours a day with no real reason of being there. So what you'll see, I think, is people that do come together, and they're doing that because they're communicating, because they're whiteboarding, because they're collaborating, where there are things that are tangible and that you can see a return on the investment or the time invested to get there. But yeah, I think real estate is in a tough place. I think what we're hearing, we've spoke to a few companies over the last year or so, comparative to many people, I suspect, and people just don't have the office space to go back to the office to the extent that they did before. They just haven't publicized that. If you talk to some of the biggest companies on the planet and you ask them, how many of your leases have you let expire in the last 12 months? People would be shocked at how high that number is. And what that means is, let's say everyone's vaccinated by the 1st of September, the 1st of September, the 1st of December, whenever. You can't go back to the office full time because they don't have 100% occupancy for you to return to. So the future that we're going towards is a lot more flexible. And I think it's going to be, it's going to be partially office based. It's going to be partially at home, and it's going to be partially in others' third spaces.
So how do you see this as even an opportunity to innovate?
For companies, or for companies from an
for
office
companies,
perspective, or companies providing space?
Both. We can discuss both.
So from a company perspective, I think the question becomes, we speak about it as a remote work dilemma, which is, if you're not as remote as your biggest competitor, they're going to steal your best people, and you're not going to be able to attract the most talented people. So you need to at least be as remote as your biggest competitor, which means you need to cut back office space as and when required. From a company perspective, I think that changes the entire paradigm around ownership of space. So it changes from a situation where they're probably leasing long-term footprint to, how can we scale this up and down as required? Maybe on a project by project basis, maybe on a city by city basis. Maybe they need 10x the space at some point in a quarter because they're going to have more people on site. Maybe they can flex that down to 0 at other points where they don't need time together. So I think being able to sort of flex up and down as required on both sides is going to be the thing that's most important to organizations, because I think they just don't want the liability of long-term leases that they just aren't going to use, quite frankly.
Definitely. And I see this also from our end all the time. Basically, one of the reasons that companies reach out to us is, I want this flexibility. I want to provide a space for my team to connect, to collaborate. But I don't need this for long term. I don't need this. And this is, I think, is a constant battle in that sense of how companies can adapt to that. So I can completely relate. Final question. This is actually a question from our Gable team, who are all big fans of your work. What is your ideal work setup and work environment?
In terms of physical setup, or where do I work on a daily basis? Like
Both. You
non-COVID?
choose. You choose. It's an open-ended question.
In terms of a setup, my setup is typically electric rise and fall desk, ergonomic chair, as many monitors as I can fit on the desk, DSLR camera. But actually, the best setup I've seen, if you search for remote working setup, Job from remote.com, he has a blog post which is the best thing I've ever seen written about this. So he goes into all the ergonomic keyboards that he has, the desk that he has, the chair that he has. That's better than I can explain to you now. In terms of my day, or my perfect remote working day, let's phrase it like that. Typically, it's waking up with the kids, having breakfast with them, dropping them at school. I like to go and work from a coffee shop for a couple of hours. So get there maybe 9, work there till 11, and then come home and I work there the most of the time. Obviously, I like spending time with my team as well. So we try and come together as frequently as we need to. With my co-founder, it's typically once a month to once a quarter, depending on how things are. During COVID, obviously not possible. And then as a wider team, we look to come together physically all at the same time, roughly once a quarter.
Okay. I think once a quarter is something that we hear a lot. It makes sense. It is like a milestone in that. And I like how you also throughout the day schedule different things. And by the way, like different locations, I think it's really nice. And it's also a change of scenery is really important. For myself, I see that I see the same. I usually do at least once or twice a week. We go to different Gable locations here in SF, really to change scenery and to talk with the customers firsthand. I find this amazing on an every day, and I think it's also helps at least me in terms of the productivity aspect. Change of scenery is important. So before we'll finish, actually we have questions from the audience. So I'll read some of them, and of course would love to hear your thoughts. So from John Lee, hi Chris. One question I have is how do companies manage the employment law, regulation, tax, and visa immigration challenges of remote work?
I mean, right now with great difficulty is probably the best answer. There are some great services out there. Remote.com, already mentioned Job, so remote.com are great. There's a few others doing similar. There's Deal, there's Panther. It depends what you need. If it's full-time employees, that's a challenge. And I think the tax, the sort of law and jurisdiction question, that is a big issue that I think we're going to see companies running into. Anecdotally, I heard a big publicly listed tech company had an offsite in one place for 3 days, and the company's the country's internal revenue reached out to them expecting that they were going to get a cut of their global revenue. Wow. I think they smoothed it over, but yeah, I mean, interesting issue.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Another question from the Conflict app is curious to know Chris's thoughts on how companies can approach providing equal employee benefits to global teams.
It's a great question. I think naturally it probably goes to the point of saying, well, what do you pay people in different regions? So yeah, I think to answer that, I think that's one that I think every team is grasping with just now. Do you pay on a geography basis, or do you pay by what people accomplish? And I think in my eyes, I would always gravitate towards the latter. Why would you justify paying someone different for any reason? Like, sure, like some cities are more expensive, but that's a personal choice. There's a lot of precedent for people getting paid less than other people throughout history, and I don't think that's a good thing. So I think people should get paid on what they produce. In terms of benefits, I think we're clearly trying to solve some of that. We're trying to make sure that people have the same setups. I think there's other people's doing other things, and I think generally it's great if organizations can give the same things to their remote workers wherever they are. It's just, how do you overcome that challenge? Because clearly there are logistical issues with doing that as well. So I think that's going to be an area for a lot of innovation.
I agree. I think that equality, no matter where you are, and providing this to all the employees, it is something that I do think that all companies should strive for, but it is a challenge to actually implement in that sense.
For sure.
Another question is, what is your best pitch towards convincing employers to invest in their employees' home office furniture?
Best is probably, if you don't, you're probably going to be held liable when they get back injuries, neck injuries, and repetitive strain injuries. So the reason that people don't get that in offices, which I think many people take for granted, is that you're sitting in an ergonomic chair that costs somewhere between $700 and $1,200. Your monitor's at the right height. You've got an ergonomic keyboard. You've got an ergonomic mouse. When things go wrong, there's ergonomic assessments, and that can be remedied pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. Right now, that hasn't really been the case at home. I think clearly because the catalyst has been a global pandemic and everyone's just tried to make do, which is totally fair. But I think longer term, companies will lose that forgiveness, for lack of a better phrase.
I agree. I think that basically the first, this literally alludes to the first thing that we talked about, like the forced work from home is not remote work. So how do we make sure that we normalize this going forward? And of course, a great home setup is fundamental. And actually it leads me to the fact, in my view, I do think that having, because for many remote employees or remote first companies, the center of, the office would be the person's own home, right? The employee's own home. That basically this is the best. This has to be the environment. And the office that you go is more exactly what you said. Is more for the ideation, the collaboration, the meaningful connections. And you don't need. You might not even need this. 2, 3, 5 monitors. You don't need all of this because basically you come for the people. You don't come for the monitor, right?
Yep.
Totally. And I think that is definitely a big shift in terms of, you definitely need to invest in this, especially, again, if you are, if you want to be a remote first company.
Yep.
Great. I think out of all questions, which were really good. So with that, I'll say thank you to you. It was a great start of my morning, and I hope a great end to your day.
Yeah, it's still early for me. I still work probably on the same time zone that you do. But yeah, I really appreciate you having me.
Of course. And thank you so much, and speak soon. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And bye-bye. Bye, Chris.